Professor Felipe Gomez-Isa, for inviting me to speak on this topic, which is the role of academia in the support to human rights defenders, and Marianne for all the hard work in making this happen. This is a topic that's been on my mind for the past decade as I've been doing research on the security and protection and well-being of human rights defenders at risk. And I came to this area motivated by my own experiences as an activist in Malaysia. And in those days, I did not call myself a human rights defender. This wasn't a term that we used in our human rights circles, and when it was used on the rare occasion, it was for very high-profile senior activists with battle scars to show for the years of trials and tribulations. I was just an activist. In a context like Malaysia, you learn quickly that there are many laws in places that inhibit your actions, for which you could be criminalized, publicly stigmatized, and arrested. I was very energized to act because I saw the injustices and I witnessed them, and I saw human rights violations against migrants and refugees, but I knew and I was warned that we had to be careful and that limits were imposed on us. I learned that we had to think creatively, to act boldly, to build alliances, to work together through collectives, and to situate our heavy, insistent, exhausting work in a very long time frame. We had to celebrate small wins. We have to learn to manage the politics of our government, but also within civil society. And I had to learn how to stay motivated and not to give up. I turned to doing a PhD partly because I was getting exhausted, but also because I was very intellectually curious and I wanted to understand deeper. I wanted to understand the world deeper around me, and that's what turned my attention to academia and scholarship, about why human rights violations took place and how we can hold governments accountable. And as I finished my PhD and applied for a job at the Center for Applied Human Rights at University of York, and some of my previous colleagues are here. I work now at Durham University. We did a number of, we did a workshop that brought together scholars and practitioners and human rights defenders to carve out a research agenda on human rights defenders at risk. And we mapped out areas that needed further research. Yeah. I've done a number of projects since then. One of them led to the Barcelona guidelines on well-being for human rights defenders on temporary relocation, and the book that you've mentioned, and also most recently a collaboration with UN Women on the situation of women, human rights defenders in migration context, and I know that that's one of the sessions that we'll have today as well. So, in reflecting on how academia can support human rights defenders, I want to answer this question by focusing on three key areas of work for which academics are judged. And this may change in emphasis from place to place, but broadly speaking, I think our work can be captured in terms of research, in terms of teaching, education, and in terms of citizenship. And I think the first way that academia can support refugees is really in our work on asking questions and finding solutions, finding answers to the questions. And, we have Angela Davis raises this question, which I think is very provocative for all of us. How do we imagine a better world and raise the questions that permit us to see beyond the given? Academia can give us the space, frameworks, and intellectual discipline and research methods to help us think through the issues that we struggle with, and also to question how and why they become issues, and how and why we struggle with them the way that we do. And there are different kinds of questions that we can ask, in research about human rights defenders. And it's important not just what the questions are, but how we ask the questions, how we collect data to understand, and for what purpose we're doing the research. So questions like, who is a human rights defender? This came up in the earlier session. And by defining who is a human rights defender, then who is not? What does security, risk, and protection mean? What is collective protection? How do protection practices reflect and change power relations between individuals and collectives in society? And when we ask these questions, whose interests do we serve? I want to share with you the words of Bell Hooks, who is a Black feminist scholar, and her words really resonate with me and inspire many of us. I will move over there because it's easier for me to read the slides. And this paragraph in her book, Teaching to Transgress, really resonated to me because I felt it was the same for me. I came to theory because I was hurting. The pain within me was so intense that I could not go on living. I came to theory desperate, wanting to comprehend, to grasp what was happening around and within me. Most importantly, I wanted to make the hurt go away, and I saw in theory then a location for healing. One of the many, in another part of a book, she says, one of the many uses of theory in academic locations is in the production of an intellectual class hierarchy, where the only work deemed truly theoretical is work that is highly abstract, jargonistic, difficult to read, and containing obscure references. And I found that when I did my master's and I did my PhD, you're reading all these things and you thought, oh my God, I thought I understood English, but clearly I don't, because it takes me 3 hours and I still don't know what they're trying to say. And so what she says is any theory that cannot be shared in everyday conversation cannot be used to educate the public. And she, like Sarah Ahmed, also says, what is really powerful theorizing, this is Sarah Ahmed's words, theorizing that's close to the skin, that people can understand and they can relate to their own lives and helps them to understand their own lives. And I want to share with you another perspective of Professor Linda Tahiwai-Smith, who, as a Maori researcher, reflects on the power of knowledge, especially the power of research on Indigenous people. And she says in her introduction to her classic book, Decolonizing Methodologies, from the vantage point of the colonized, a position from which I write and choose to privilege, the term research is inextricably linked to European imperialism and colonialism. The word itself, research, is probably one of the dirtiest words in the Indigenous world's vocabulary. When mentioned in many Indigenous contexts, it stirs up silence, it conjures up bad memories, it raises a smile that is knowing and distrustful. It is so powerful that Indigenous people even write poetry about research, the ways in which scientific research is implicated in the worst excesses of colonialism remains a powerful, remembered history for many of the world's colonized peoples. So research in itself is not politically neutral. Research and knowledge is linked to power. And I reflect on the words of Ignacio Martin Barro, who challenges us in the ways that we conceptualize and we think and we do research about people, for people, and argues for, he's a psychologist, social psychologist, Jesuit priest and philosopher, and as you know, he was assassinated because of his work. And he reminds us that for psychology to be liberating, we need to recover historical memory. Don't assume that human nature is universal. A person in one context and a person in another is not the same. To really pay attention to social and political processes, and to discover from collective memory the past and a sense of identity and culture that can be used for liberation. How did we liberate ourselves before, and how can we bring that to the present to liberate ourselves? He talks about de-idealizing everyday experience, to disrupt discourses that deny, that ignore and disguise realities, and to give people data, information, so that they can form a consciousness of their own realities. And in the panels we've heard over the past day, we've heard about the dangers of misinformation, the power of stigmatization. These are all discourses that are anti-human rights defenders, anti-human rights, but they're so powerful unless people can have the information and the data and the processes to think for themselves and to grasp their realities. And to utilize the people's virtues and he challenges us to see the rich potential in people rather than seeing them as victims or powerless. So how can academia support human rights defenders? By asking questions and facilitating human rights defenders in asking questions, by applying theories and concepts to find the answers, by thinking through ethics and responsibilities in research and building knowledge about and for human rights defenders, and making research findings impactful in laws, policies, and practices. To support research by human rights defenders for human rights defenders, by developing research partnerships that are respectful, participatory, and impact-oriented, by conducting research that is relevant, that is liberatory, and that strengthens movements. Another area that academia is very heavily involved in, as you know, is education. And really, we are challenged to think about how we educate and for what purpose do we educate. Are we educating to reinforce or disrupt power relations and structures of oppression? Are we reinforcing or disrupting them? And Louis Althusser, a philosopher, challenges us to think whether our educational institutions are just functioning as an ideological state apparatus. Are we just reinforcing government power, maintaining the power of the bourgeoisie, and keeping the proletariat in false class consciousness? How does our education conscientize? Drawing on Paulo Freire's work that has been so inspirational for so many of us. How does our education encourage critical awareness of our realities through dialogue, reflection, and action? And recognizing interlocking systems of oppression that exist in all the spaces that we're in, how do we create spaces for dialogue and reflection in the classroom, out of the classroom, in our tutorials, where people can bring their whole selves into the conversation and see themselves in the material that they read and engage with? How do we foster recognition that our experiences are reflective of broader historical, social, political, and economic forces? And how do we teach so that we can support people who are marginalized and discriminated against in society so that they can resist and transform oppressive structures? And Paulo Freire, this is one of the quotes that he's known for: washing our hands of the conflict between the powerful and the powerless means to side with the powerful, not to be neutral. And our classrooms are not neutral spaces. So how can academia support human rights defenders through education? By revealing and disrupting existing power relations, creating spaces for dialogue, preferably brave spaces where we can talk about topics that are uncomfortable, that reveal inequalities, not just safe spaces, because that usually sides with the majority. How can we bring people from diverse backgrounds and perspectives together to interact and exchange ideas? How can we promote human rights education at all levels and for all sectors of society, not just in universities, but all across society? How can we approach teaching in a way that conscientizes, reveals power structures, liberates and fosters hope, and bring people into human rights movements, into living a human rights life, and sustaining this in the face of all the pressures and harms that we know human rights defenders experience? And the third area I want to cover is citizenship. And I want to start off with questions we need to ask ourselves in academia. And these are questions we need to ask ourselves as a sector, as institutions, and as individuals. So what is the role of academia in society? What is our reason for being? Why are we here? Why do we perpetuate this system? How do we relate it to issues in society? What is our stand on human rights? What is the stand of our university? What is our relationship with human rights movements? What are tangible ways of making a difference for today and for the future? What risks are we willing to take for human rights movements, and how can we protect ourselves and each other as we face these risks? To be involved in human rights work is to take a stand. And sometimes that means risks. And sometimes our institutions are very, very conservative and do not want to take risks. And we have to ask ourselves, then what is our relationship with our institutions? And this part of my talk is really directed to younger scholars and those of us in academia as well, because we know that pressures and constraints on academics to perform can actually pull us away from what is relevant and impactful for human rights movements. We are pressured on all sides. Publish, teach, do this, serve in that committee, review this article, sit in that process, blah, 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 and it pushes on all sides. What's more, if you want to have a family, if you want to have relationships that last, if you don't want families that break up, yeah? So there are pressures on all sides. Academic institutions, one of the challenges is also that academic institutions can be very conservative. They can be capitalist. They can be very supportive of existing power relations. They can be fearful and risk-adverse. And one challenge that we all face really is the curtailment of academic freedom. And around the world, you see scholars at risk. You see people who are, for speaking up, for even sharing ideas about society, they are targeted. Yeah? Academics are also targeted. And so we have to watch out for our freedom of expression, opinion, and information. And one of the challenges we face is also academic sensibilities that position real scholarship as not activist. Yeah? And I've interacted with scholars who say, ooh, if you do activism, then that's not real scholarship, or that dirties your work somehow. Yeah? That considers some voices as valuable and others as not, that judges writing from lived experience of oppression as too angry. And that's what Bell Hooks observed. But Stuart Hall, who's a sociologist, reminds us, struggle where you are. You will face these challenges. Struggle where you are. You can't do everything. You fight the battles that you can fight. And so maybe, what are some thoughts I can suggest for us to discuss and debate together? How can we meet these challenges? I think especially for the early career and for those of us who are trying to make our way in academia, try to understand and play the academic game the best you can while supporting human rights defenders. But recognizing that early career scholars are under much more pressure to comply with existing rules and rationalities, and the more senior academics can try to challenge them. Narrate your work so that it is legible to those in power and so that it resonates with what they care about, prioritize and reward. Whether that's trying to get funding or narrating your work as internationalization, focusing on publications, focusing on research impact. Recognize, however, that academic institutions are imperialist, supremacist, racist, patriarchal, heterosexist, and capitalist. So how is it so in your context? Which means that they favor some people over others. And don't let this rob you of your voice and your perspective. And let's proactively cultivate diversity and inclusion and value difference in our spaces. Be a feminist killjoy, be a willful subject, drawing on Sarah Ahmed. Choose the margins, as Linda Tohiwai Smith says. Choose research and education that is feminist, decolonial, anti-racist, radical, critical, that sides with the oppressed, as Martin Barrow encourages us to. Recognize that scholarly work and activist work does not always go together. Some work you will do just for scholars, some you will do for activists. Some can nourish both. You can always do more. Academia is always hungry for more of your labor. You can always work harder. So you have to draw and maintain boundaries and help others to do so. You will be faced with dilemmas. You may need to make decisions that put human rights defenders and movements as a higher priority than your own academic career. We need community, so find like-minded mentors and companions on your journey, mentor others, and be a good companion. Find inspiration from others, inspire others. Keep companions and texts near you that encourage you, and that I get from Sarah Ahmed. So, academia, in terms of citizenship, supporting human rights defenders, we can promote and protect academia as an institution that discusses and debates human rights. We can contribute to political and administrative thinking and decision-making that protects human rights defenders, inviting defenders into these spaces so that we're not always speaking for them. Invite human rights defenders into academic institutions on fellowships so that they can rest, rejuvenate, think, and learn. Honor human rights defenders with formal recognition, helping them to build legitimacy and credibility. Critique interlocking systems of oppression, and analyze actors, relations, and structures in society to promote systemic structural change. Yeah. The question for us to deliberate that I was given to think about is what is the role of academia in the support to human rights defenders? But I also want to raise another question. How are academic institutions and academics being human rights defenders? And how can we be in meaningful solidarity with each other? Thank you.